Philosophic Critiques of Locke, Rousseau and Hegel, Lecture 1. At this point, we enter the final part of the course, which is entitled The Progressive and Liberal Challenge to the Founding Principles. And we begin by going pretty far back to the 1700s and early 1800s. Now, we are beginning here a series of classes on the progressive movement and the later liberal or lowercase p progressive movements that inform the liberal or progressive side of American politics today. And this is important to study not only because the ideas are intrinsically interesting, but also because you really can't understand how the American government works today unless you have familiarity with the principles of the founders and the principles of progressive and liberal reformers, because the actual American government that we have today is really a composite of founding principles embodied in the Constitution, but then also progressive reforms, which have altered the understanding of those principles or added principles of their own. And so, really, the American government today is a kind of hybrid of the principles of progressivism and the principles of the founding. And so, and really, I think one of the most important things to learn from the next few classes can be stated very straightforwardly, which is that on a philosophic and on a practical level, progressivism and modern liberalism fundamentally reject most of the principles embodied in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Progressives or liberals, they understand human nature differently. They understand the purpose of government differently. And therefore, it's not just the case that modern American government is a kind of hybrid of founding and progressive principles, but it's actually a product of two fundamentally opposed strains of thought, that of the founders and the progressives. So it's a conflicted hybrid. Now, I want to note that I am not here as the professor to tell you that one side is right and the other side is wrong. I don't see that as my job. I don't think it should be my job. It is up to you to decide what political principles you agree with or you think are best. My job is to help you to think for yourself about these questions of political principles by giving you an accurate understanding of some of the contenders. Right. So my job is to present the principles of the founding accurately and to present the principles of various progressive and liberal reformers accurately, because you really can't make an informed and responsible judgment unless you have an adequate understanding of what the different sides really thought. And I think you might agree that a lot of the arguing that we see in the past and in our society today is partly fueled by the fact that people that disagree with one another do not bother to figure out in a sort of honest and charitable way what the other side actually thinks and why. So you might say that in a way that my goal in this class, especially in this part of the class, is not to teach you what side is right and what side is wrong, but to help you to deliberate in a civil manner about the merits and the weaknesses of both sides so that you can make up your own mind. So today you read some selections from the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Rousseau was active in the mid-1700s. Hegel was active in the early 1800s. So, in other words, we're starting a section of the class on American progressive and liberal reform by actually going back to 18th century France and 19th century Germany, which might seem kind of weird. Why not start with the Americans? I had you do this, though, because just as the founders' principles can be traced back to philosophic sources, Locke, Montesquieu, and others, it's also the case that the American progressives' principles can be traced back to philosophic sources. And here, I would say it's primarily Hegel and more indirectly Rousseau, but Rousseau was influential. So in the same way that in the first part of the class, we started with fundamental principles by beginning with Locke. In this part of the class, we start with fundamental principles too by looking at two of the most important philosophical sources of modern progressivism. And we will be starting with Rousseau in the next lecture, but in the remainder of this lecture, I wanted to just remind you of the basic principles of the founding as I have presented it in this class. Now, many of the things that I've presented are, I'm abstracting from a lot of historical detail. Some things are overly simplified. There was more disagreement out there than you might get the impression of. I'm trying to stick to the main tendencies and the main principles. In the most basic sense, starting with the Declaration, you could say that, kind of the fundamental principle of the founders' politics is the claim that human beings are by nature equal in their rights to life, liberty, property, free exercise, and generally speaking, the pursuit of happiness. And you find statements about these rights, these natural rights, in the state constitutions and their preambles or bills of rights, and you find it in the Declaration. So this wasn't this claim that we are by nature equal and entitled to the natural rights to life, liberty, and property is not something that's only in the Declaration or only came out of the mind of Jefferson. I mean, this was a generally held opinion, and you can see that by looking at the published official documents during the Revolutionary period and the early founding. So you have this basic principle that we are by nature equal in our rights to life, liberty, property, free exercise of religion, and generally speaking, the pursuit of happiness. Now, this way of thinking about natural rights does have its roots in a kind of natural law thinking, which you also find in Locke. This is mentioned in the Declaration, for example, in the notion of the laws of nature and nature's God. And now this is it's a fairly simple understanding of natural law, say in comparison to something like Catholicism. But basically this idea that we can discover by reason that we have a right and a duty to preserve ourselves, that human beings have a right and a duty of self-preservation. That's why Locke kind of summarizes the natural law as preserve humanity, or preserve yourself with the least possible harm to other human beings. Now, obviously, this right is rooted in our possession of reason, right? We can be subject to a natural law because we possess a faculty of reason whereby we can not only try to understand the world, but also come to have an understanding of what we ought or ought not to do. So as rational creatures, human beings, for the founders, are different from the rest of nature, which is not seen as being rational. And obviously, in various ways, many of them saw human beings as subordinate to a creator, a divine creator, who is the author of nature, the author of humanity and the human soul, and the author of our fundamental rights and duties. So even though there's a lot of disagreement in terms of details, that was generally a consensus position. We and the world are the product of a divine creator, and we have reason, which distinguishes us from the rest of the animals. Now, given that the law of nature is the preservation of humanity, it follows directly from that law that we as individuals have a right to preserve ourselves, both in the sense of the right to acquire what we need in order to survive, and also the right to defend ourselves against aggression at the hands of others. So you have that fundamental right to self-preservation. And from this right to self-preservation, loosely, follows also the right to liberty. Now, you remember for Locke, natural liberty is defined as the right to be your own master, the right to follow your own judgment and your own will in all matters, as long as you're not violating the law of nature. And as such, you therefore are never rightfully subject to the arbitrary will of other human beings. Right? So we have a right to be our own masters. We don't have a right to break the law of nature, but we have the right to govern our own lives, and we do not have the right to govern other people's lives. Really, the only exception there, as you might recall from Locke, is that children are rightfully subject to the authority of their parents precisely because reason in children is not fully developed yet. They're not fully grown. Once children are sufficiently grown, they also become free. and have a right to govern themselves. But prior to the acquisition of sufficient reason, people are rightfully subject to somebody else. But once you have reason, you are your own master. And why is it the case that the right to self-preservation leads to this right to be your own master? And here we have what the kind of the fundamental anthropological assumption of the philosophy of the founding, which is that human reason or human nature has two important characteristics. One, the possession of reason. The possession of reason is what makes us capable of being free. By virtue of having reason, we become capable of understanding the law of nature, and therefore are capable of being held responsible for abiding by it. But if we have sufficient reason to understand what we ought and ought not do, then we have the right to make our own decisions about that. We don't need somebody else to come along and say, no, you don't understand, just do what I say. For the founders, for Locke, who say, no, a normal adult human being has enough reason to govern himself. And if he does something wrong, then he should be punished. Right. But the presumption is in favor of you run your own life. You've got enough reason, you can run your own life and be held responsible for what you do. But alongside reason, which makes it possible for you to be free, there is also human fallibility, our weaknesses and our defects. Human beings, we possess reason, but our reason itself is oftentimes wrong, right? Just because we have reason doesn't mean that we're always reasonable, doesn't mean that we always know the truth. And not only is our reason imperfect, but we also possess various passions and appetites that are oftentimes much stronger than reason and that urge us to do things that are wrong or bad, right, or harmful to others or harmful to ourselves. Right? So we have reason, but we are fallible. We are imperfect. And because we are imperfect, according to Locke, what that entails is that no human being can claim the right to govern others without their consent, to turn to somebody else and say, nope, you must do what I say or else. For Locke, for the founders, only God has the requisite qualifications to govern others in such an absolute manner, right? Because for Locke, absolute authority is only justified when there is an assurance that it won't be abused. And the only time when you can be assured that absolute power will not be abused is when that absolute power is being wielded by a being that is all-knowing, therefore won't make mistakes that will harm you, all good, that is to say, wants what's good for you rather than wanting to harm you, and all powerful, and therefore capable of doing those good things. So only an all-knowing, all good, all powerful being can claim a right to govern others in an absolute manner without their consent. But since human beings are not perfect in that way, we cannot claim the right to govern others. We have enough reason to govern ourselves individually, but we do not have sufficiently perfect character to be able to claim the right to govern others. And, in a kind of simplified way, for Locke, the idea is either somebody else is your master by nature and you're subject to them, or you are your own master. And since nobody else is your master by nature, then the only other option is you. You're in charge of yourself because of your reason and your fallibility. So because we have a right to preserve ourselves, because we have reason but are imperfect, it follows that we have a right to be our own masters, not subject to the arbitrary will or authority of other human beings. And then, of course, you also have the right to property. For Locke, there is a natural right to private property because we have a natural right to acquire for ourselves and use those things which we need and which our time and our talent and our efforts can acquire for us. Right? You have a right to the fruits of your labor. And again, that follows from being naturally free. If nobody else owns you, you are your own master. If you are your own master, you get to decide what you do with your time and your talent and your effort. And because of that also, since you freely decide what you do with your time, your talent, and your effort, you are entitled to the fruits of those efforts, and nobody else. And this is why slavery is contrary to natural law, or is contrary to natural right, according to Locke. Now, of course, there's also the natural right to free exercise of religion, but that's not going to come up in this part of the class, so I won't summarize that. So, on the basis of this claim that all human beings equally possess a right to life, a right to liberty, and a right to property, it follows that our natural state, our natural condition, or what Locke calls the state of nature, is one where human beings, although they may be interacting with one another, are nonetheless not subject to some common human authority. There's no government. Human beings might associate, but there is no government. There is no group of people who are entitled to make laws for everybody and force people to obey those laws, right? And that's the essence of government. That's the essence of political power, right? For Locke, to possess political power means to have the right to make laws and to enforce those laws on a community of human beings. By nature, we do not have the right to make and enforce laws upon others. So where does that right come from? Well, so here's the thing. In the state of nature, we might have a right to be free, but in fact, our natural rights are extremely insecure and perhaps even useless in such an anarchic state, because that's what the state of nature is. It's anarchy, people associating with nobody in charge. Because human beings are imperfect, and some human beings are quite wicked, what that means is that an anarchical state of nature is extremely dangerous. Your rights are extremely insecure. Yes, you have a right to self-preservation, but that's not going to stop somebody from killing you if they want to. Yes, you have a right to be free, but that by itself is not going to stop somebody from trying to enslave you. Right? So you might have these natural rights, but they're not necessarily respected. And as Locke notes, in an anarchic state of nature, there are really three things missing that you need in order for your rights to be secure. In the state of nature, there is no commonly acknowledged law, right? So there's not consensus about the rules are. There is no impartial judge, right? Since there are no judicial institutions or anything like that, everybody's the judge in their own case, and people are biased. So there's no commonly acknowledged law, there is no impartial adjudication of disputes, and there is no reliable enforcement of the law, right? Everybody is basically judge, jury, and executioner. But since some human beings are much more powerful than others, in the state of nature, what you really end up with is the rule of the stronger. Those who are powerful enough to impose their will on others will do so. And so obviously what that means is if your rights are going to be secure, what you need is commonly acknowledged law, impartial adjudication of disputes, right, when there's disagreements under the law, and reliable execution of the law. You need to have those three things. And this is where government comes in. For Locke, government, the political community and government, they don't exist by nature. They come into being precisely for the purpose of protecting the rights of people from harm. Your rights are insecure in the state of nature. Governments are, as the Declaration of Independence says, governments are instituted among men in order to secure those rights. Now, it's important to note that because what that means is that, for the founders, and for Locke and the founders, in basically the same way, the purpose of government is actually, it's not low, but it's not high either, right? The primary purpose of government is to secure rights from harm. The goal of government is not, as Aristotle would say, to teach people how to be virtuous. Virtue is not the end of government. Nor is it, say, what the Puritans had in mind of teaching people to get to heaven. Right? The purpose of government is not virtue. The purpose of government is not salvation. It's not that the founders don't believe in virtue and salvation. They believe in both and think both things are really quite important. But neither virtue nor salvation are the direct object of governmental action. Just as for them, the production of wealth is not, and the distribution of wealth is not the proper object of direct government action. Government is there to secure your rights from harm, and all those other aspects of human life should be pursued by human beings, in their private capacity as co-workers, as neighbors, as members of churches, members of smaller communities of various kinds. So there are lots of really important and high things in human life that are just not necessarily the job of government. The government's job is necessary. That basic security is necessary for those other societies to flourish. Right, in a warlike and anarchical situation, it's going to be really hard to have a flourishing church, for example. Right. So when you have law and order, peace, security in your rights, then all the other aspects of human life are made better and more possible. So the purpose of government is not virtue or salvation, but the security of rights. Now, even though the purpose of government is the security of rights, that doesn't mean that somebody can come along and, like Alexander the Great or something, say, okay, I'm in charge here now. Everybody has to do what I say and I'll protect all of you. You can't do that. The purpose of government is the security of rights. But since we are by nature free, government must be based on the consent of the governed. People must willingly lay down their natural freedom in return for protection by government. Right? This is why governments must be based on the consent of the governed. People must agree to be governed. And for Locke, what this means is they transfer from possessing natural freedom to possessing civil freedom. Natural freedom, again, is the right to be your own master within the limits of the law of nature. Civil freedom is the right to be your own master within the limits of the law of the land, right? Because when you create government, there are going to be human laws, and you've got to abide by those laws. But as the old saying goes, where the law is silent, you can decide for yourself, right? So you might have laws, defining contracts and things like that, but it's still up to you what contracts you make and with whom and on what terms and things like that. So civil freedom is the right to be your own master within the limits of the law, which law must be derived from a legitimate legislature. So that's civil freedom. Now, the consent of the governed primarily refers to this establishment of, what we would now call a constitution. Members of a political community must agree to join that community and live under a form of government. And that's what the fundamental act of consent is. It's not elections. But when you establish government, for Locke, since the three things that are lacking in the state of nature are commonly acknowledged law, impartial adjudication, and reliable execution of the law, then government, the creation of government necessarily entails the creation of the power to make laws. So you do have a commonly acknowledged law, the power to adjudicate disputes under the law. So, judiciary power, and an executive power, a power that executes the laws. So that's where you get those three powers of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. So those are the powers that government has to exercise in order to secure your rights. But remember, as Madison points out in Federalist 51, human beings are not angels, right? We are imperfect. And that human imperfection exists not only in those who are governed, but also in those who wield political power. So when you organize political institutions, if they're going to function, that human imperfection, that human fallibility, has to be incorporated into your institutions. Your institutions have to be based on a realistic understanding of the limits and abilities of human nature. And what that means in particular here is that governmental institutions must be organized with a view to the fact that human beings will oftentimes, either out of selfish or wicked motives, seek to abuse their power. So you need to create governmental institutions that are safe in that sense, right? As Madison says in Federalist 51, when it comes to government, first, the government, you need to make the government capable of controlling the governed. And then in the second place, you have to make sure that the government controls itself. So you need safeguards built into your institutions so that power is not abused. And this is a difficult thing to do because, of course, the very thing that makes government necessary, namely human imperfection, also makes government dangerous because the human beings who exercise governmental power are themselves imperfect. And that's why there are a few kind of precautions that the founders build into things. So obviously, one of the precautions built into government is you want to make government accountable through regular elections, or at least most parts of the government. Right? Formal accountability through elections is one way of keeping people in check. That's why the House and the Senate and the president are all periodically have to stand for re-election. So you need elections to put a check on governmental power. You need separation of powers. Remember, this was very important in Montesquieu, that since human beings will seek to abuse power, at least from time to time, and try to govern in an arbitrary way rather than in accordance with law, you need to make sure that the people who make the rules aren't the same as the people who enforce the rules. Because if the people who make the rules are also the ones who enforce the rules, then guess what? They're not going to enforce those rules on themselves. They're not going to enforce those rules on their friends. They're going to collect taxes from other people, but they're not going to collect taxes from themselves. They're going to punish other people. They're not going to punish themselves. So if you want real rule of law, where everybody is subject to the same rules so that everybody's rights are secure, you have to make sure that the people who make the rules are also subject to the rules. And the most fundamental way you do that is by making sure that some people make the rules, but other people enforce them. That's separation of powers. And then alongside separation of powers, in order to keep those powers separate, you need checks and balances. You need ways for the legislature to check the executive to make sure that the executive doesn't overstep its authority. And you need to give the executive the power to check the legislature so that it can stop the legislature from overstepping its authority. So elections, separation of powers, and checks and balances are all important safeguards built into government in order to make sure that government governs according to law in an equal and fair manner, rather than tyrannically or arbitrarily for the interests of those who hold power. So that's a basic kind of summary of the big principles of the Constitution and of the American founding. In the next class, we will talk about the challenge to Locke's political philosophy and to a number of these principles issued by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the mid-1800s.